Good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about our trip to Cuba. We feel very fortunate to have been able to take this trip, and a lot of consideration went into the reasons for going and why we wanted to go. And as we said when we first announced that we were considering going, it was really, we have two focuses primarily. One is fact-finding, and the second was relationship building. We did not go with an expectation, as you do sometimes on trade missions, of coming home with signed contracts or agreements. That was not our intention, and as such, that wasn't what we attempted to undertake while we were there. But let me first, I'm going to talk a little bit first, and then I'll turn it over to Council Chair Gertis, and then to my Deputy Mayor, Dr. Kinane. But when it came to fact-finding, we wanted to see for ourselves really perception versus reality. There's certainly, over history, been a lot of things said about Cuba, a lot of information out there about Cuba, and we wanted to really see for ourselves. And before we took the trip out to Cuba on this fact-finding mission, we also wanted to sit with some of our own folks who are employees here in St. Petersburg, who are Cuban Americans or have family that still live in Cuba, and get a perspective from them before we took the trip. And we certainly appreciate them for sharing their personal stories and the stories of their families with us. So with that information in mind, we flew to Cuba on Thursday morning, and some of the things I think that, at least from my observations, are that the Cuban people I found to be very warm, outgoing, friendly, welcoming to Americans. There was not a hatred of America or Americans. They are a very proud people, very proud of their country, and very nationalistic in their outlook. And talk about the revolution and how they got to where they're at. We saw private businesses. Not everything was owned by the government. And most of the private businesses that existed tended to be more in the tourism industries, with restaurants, hotels, shops that cater to tourism, as tourism is a big economic driver that we saw. We also, in speaking with government officials, and I'll talk a little bit about the relationship building in a minute, but what struck me was the honesty of the government officials that we met with. They acknowledged the challenges that their country is facing, and the areas in which improvement is needed, and also talked about the impact that the embargo that the United States has had on the country, but more so on the Cuban people. Because of this embargo, their access to credit is extremely limited. And as we who are in government here thought about what that would be like for us, and how much of what we're able to do in improving our infrastructure is based on our ability to obtain credit and to bond. And they don't have that ability. And as such, what you see there is an infrastructure that they're really struggling with, and are really behind on, and they know that. And so having access to credit is really quite important. But the Cuban people, there's some concern about what happens if the embargo is lifted. And what I also got a sense of is that the Cuban people really, they trust the government. Again, they're fiercely nationalistic and quite proud of their heritage. As far as the relationship building aspect of the trip, it's important to note, we did have to cut the trip short. Our intention was to leave Sunday morning, but with a potential hurricane that was coming to our shores and to their shores. We ended up having to leave Saturday morning, which meant we were not able to meet with some of their economic advisors and visit the University of Havana, and certainly that was disappointing, but it certainly called to mind how much we have in common with the country, with St. Petersburg and the country of Cuba. We both are coastal communities. We both have to deal with climate change and sea level rise, and certainly this storm event called great attention to those similarities that we have. We were able to meet with the Deputy Chief of North American Affairs, Gustavo Machine, and I know Charlie, Council Chair Gertis, is going to talk a little bit more about that, but I found that conversation with him to be very enlightening, and again, I talked about honesty. I found him to be very forthright with us in his discussion of the relationship between their country and ours and the challenges that they face. I was very forthright with him about our desire here in St. Petersburg to be the place where they locate a consulate office. We let him know that there are 80,000 Cubans who live in the Tampa Bay area, 1 million more within a 4-hour drive of St. Petersburg. And when you think that the first Cuban in Florida, Panfilo de Narvaez, I probably pronounced that wrong. Thank you. Landed here in St. Petersburg before anywhere else in the state of Florida. We do have a connection. We also let them know that we are capable of handling a consulate office. We have in St. Petersburg the first on the west coast of Florida. Calais Gold Standard accredited police department and an assistant chief of police who is a specialist in diplomatic protection. So locating a consulate office here certainly in our mind makes perfect sense, and we were very honored and pleased to share that with Mr. Machin. Also had some time to spend with the Secretary of the Provincial Assembly of the City of Havana, Francisco Sanchez, and had a very nice conversation with him. And once again, I think what was very apparent is that whether your city is in St. Petersburg or it's Havana in Cuba, local governments, we all have things in common that we share. We all have challenges that we share in making sure that the lives of our citizens who reside in our city are taken care of: public safety, education, quality of life, dealing with issues of poverty, providing opportunities in parks and recreation. We share these things in common. So we certainly enjoyed our conversation with the Secretary Sanchez. Deputy Mayor will talk about our meeting with Alfredo Luis Roche, the Director of International Relations for the Cuban Ministry of Culture. The only comment I will make is, again, when we talk about things that we have in common, Havana and Cuba are rich in arts and culture. And we like to think of ourselves here in St. Petersburg as being the cultural center for the southeastern United States. And that certainly is an area that we share in common, a love of culture, knowing how arts and culture impacts our communities. And I think it's fair to say we were blown away by what we saw and the beauty of their arts and culture. And Chair Gertis will talk a little bit in greater detail about our meeting with the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy, Scott Hamilton. But again, it was fascinating hearing the differences that he was able to describe between a Cuba of even 10 years ago and a Cuba today. So this was a very worthwhile trip. I think we accomplished our goals of really seeing firsthand, to the degree we could within 2 days, what's going on in Cuba, and in starting to build those relationships that are so important as their country and our country continue to work toward achieving more normalized relations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chair Gertis.
Thank you, Mayor. I think first I want to thank the mayor and the Alliance for Responsible Cuba Policy for putting the trip together and for inviting me on the trip. I'll tell you, when the mayor first brought up the prospect of the trip to me, my first reaction was, I want nothing to do with this unless it's a substantive trip and it's a business trip, and we're actually going to try and accomplish some things. And the mayor assured me that that was the agenda, and I can tell you now, having been on the trip and come back, while we didn't bring back signed contracts or any kind of trade deals or anything like that, the trip was nothing but substantive. From the time we landed until the time we took off, we were in meetings all day long till 10 o'clock at night. Then you'd come back to the hotel and scramble to get on the internet for 2 hours and try and catch up on your emails. So the first impression I want to make sure you capture is this was a very, very substantive trip with very good dialogue. And the first evidence of that is our first meeting at 8:30 in the morning on Friday was with the Deputy Director of USA Affairs for the Cuban Foreign Ministry, Mr. Gustavo Machín. And the level of authority to which the Cuban government attended this meeting, the third person, basically, Foreign Minister, Chief of the Division of U.S. Affairs, and Mr. Machín is just below that, I think tells you a lot about what the Cuban government was hoping to accomplish in our visit as well. This is a man who has been ambassador to Peru for Cuba. He's been the ambassador to Pakistan for Cuba. He served at the U.S. Embassy, and anybody that Googles his name will know that he actually was expelled from the United States. But the point is, he's a very substantive policy leader in Cuba. He was directly, personally involved in the conversations and discussions that led to the normalization of diplomatic relationships and the opening of the embassies in Washington, D.C. and in Havana, and was with Secretary Kerry when the embassy was opened a couple of weeks ago. As the mayor's already mentioned, Mr. Machín was, I think forthright is a diplomatic word. I think he was brutally honest and shared with us that if we continue to focus on the differences in governance and how you should govern, who should govern, and things like that, there are many, many other more important human dignity issues that are being ignored because everyone is focusing on this one difference. He pointed out that in the recent Ebola crisis in Africa, the only country that had more doctors addressing that crisis than the United States was Cuba. The Cuban doctors and the American doctors worked together at the same facilities. The United States Army Corps of Engineers transported the Cuban doctors to Africa and built the wards and facilities that the Cuban doctors and healthcare providers provided in Africa. The Cuban government and the American government have been cooperating in drug interdiction in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico for a long time. Cuba wants no drugs in their country, and they don't want drugs getting to the United States either. So the Coast Guard and the Cuban military have been cooperating for a long time. We just never hear about that. And there are other specific examples of cooperation. One of the things that the mayor mentioned, they're a proud people of their country and their heritage. Ambassador Machín pointed out their literacy rate is 100%. There's not a school child in Cuba that doesn't read or write. Their violent crime rate, he invited us to walk the streets of Havana at any time of day or night. He pointed out that he's been to embassies all around the world, and that the Marines at the United States Embassy in Havana could walk the streets in their uniforms and not worry about a single attack or any kind of problem with the citizens of Cuba, because the citizens of Cuba loved the Marines and were so happy that the embassy was open, and that this was one of the few places in the world where Marines could freely walk with their uniform on and not be worried about any kind of repercussions. Mayor Kriseman directly and just as bluntly told Ambassador Machine that we would love to be the home of the consulate in Florida. Ambassador Machine pointed out where consulates would not be. He didn't mention St. Petersburg in that list and told us that we should pursue that through the State Department, and thought that that was a very good idea. And he understands, you know, the Cuban government knows Tampa very well because of the strong Cuban community there, and he thought that the Bay Area would be a great place for a consulate. So we will definitely follow up on that. The last thing I want to point out about that visit is we were at the Foreign Ministry Department of the Cuban government. It was no palatial place. It was as run down and as in need of maintenance as all the other buildings that we saw in Cuba. This to me really stuck out because it's not like the government is pouring money into its own buildings and taking care of itself while they ignore the people and let the residences and the infrastructure deteriorate, which is what we saw, in all honesty, was a uniform deterioration of buildings and structures. Although the highways and the roads were very clean, passable, no potholes, but the buildings themselves, you know, in the state, the Foreign Ministry building, windows all over the building were open, blinds were flying out of the windows. It just was not an ostentatious place at all. I think that speaks a lot about, you know, we may disagree with their version of human dignity being equal and social justice being applied, but I can tell you that egalitarianism is plainly visible in the sense that the haves and the have-nots, like you see in other impoverished countries where you see mansions up on the hill and cardboard box houses, that's not what you see in Cuba. You see a uniform deterioration, and that struck me. Our next meeting, directly from there, and this was about a 2-hour meeting with Ambassador Machine. Directly from there, we went back to the hotel and we met with the Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy, Scott Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton was also directly involved in the talks that led to the normalization of diplomatic relations, and Mr. Hamilton shared with us that he thought much progress had been made because the United States administration had made a singularly important decision. The dialogue will no longer be adversarial and accusatory. The dialogue will be, how can we solve mutual problems? How can we benefit from mutual opportunities? So that the entire tenor of the dialogue and communication between the two governments flipped from, why don't you do this? Why aren't you doing that? How come you do it this way? To, what can we accomplish? How can we make things better for the Cuban people, and how can the American people benefit from an economic, business, and commerce standpoint?